Never judge a book by its cover. That's what one waitress learned the hard way when she insulted a customer for his simple clothing, only to realize too late that he wasn't just anyone. What happened next left everyone in the restaurant speechless. We often think we can tell everything about a person just by looking at them. Their clothes, their posture, the way they speak, we assume these things reveal their worth. But sometimes our assumptions couldn't be more wrong. This story proves that status and wealth don't always come wrapped in a designer suit. And when one arrogant waitress found that out the hard way, her world turned upside down. The evening had settled over Beverly Hills, painting the city in hues of deep amber and soft lavender. The streets, lined with luxury boutiques and high-end storefronts, shimmered under the glow of golden streetlights. Exotic cars purred down the wide boulevards, their sleek exteriors reflecting the neon signs of exclusive clubs and designer stores. Pedestrians, dressed in tailored suits and elegant evening gowns, moved with purpose, their laughter mingling with the distant hum of the city. Nestled among these dazzling sights stood Le Ciel, one of the most prestigious restaurants in all of Los Angeles. A place reserved for the elite, the kind of establishment where reservations were made weeks in advance, and the guest list read like a who's who of Hollywood and high society. The exterior exuded sophistication, with its sleek glass facade and softly glowing sign, promising an evening of indulgence to those who stepped inside. Inside, the air was thick with refinement. Soft candlelight flickered across the pristine white tablecloths, casting intricate shadows on the walls. A grand chandelier hung in the center of the room, its crystals refracting light in a dazzling display. The scent of truffle-infused dishes and aged wine lingered in the air, mingling with the faintest hint of fresh roses placed delicately at each table. The guests were exactly as one would expect: polished, wealthy, and impeccably dressed. Men wore designer suits, their cufflinks gleaming under the soft glow of ambient lighting. Women draped in couture dresses sipped on champagne, their manicured fingers adorned with glistening diamonds. Conversations were spoken in hushed tones, punctuated by soft laughter, as waiters glided between tables, refilling crystal glasses and serving artfully plated dishes. Everything was perfect. Every movement, every detail, meticulously curated to uphold the restaurant's reputation. Then the door swung open. A rush of cool air from the outside world disturbed the controlled ambience of the restaurant, sending a faint ripple of unease through the room. Heads turned instinctively toward the entrance. A man stepped inside. At first, no one paid much attention. New guests arrived all the time. Celebrities, CEOs, socialites. But as the seconds passed, the subtle shift in atmosphere became unmistakable. This man was different. Unlike the usual clientele, he wasn't draped in a tailored Armani suit or wearing a designer watch that shimmered under the lights. He wasn't accompanied by an entourage or exuding the air of someone important. He was ordinary. Jeans, slightly worn, not distressed in a fashionable way, just well used. A simple t-shirt, neither oversized nor tight, just comfortable, and an old, slightly faded jacket, one that looked like it had seen years of wear, rather than being a part of some luxury fashion collection. His shoes weren't polished Italian leather, but a pair of basic sneakers, scuffed at the edges, practical rather than stylish. It didn't take long for the first signs of judgment to surface. A woman at a nearby table wrinkled her nose, barely masking her distaste. A young couple exchanged knowing glances, their lips curling in amused smirks. At another table, a group of sharply dressed businessmen cast brief, dismissive looks his way before returning to their conversation. But no one reacted as strongly as Ashley, the head waitress. Ashley had been working at Le Ciel for years. She knew the clientele, their habits, their expectations. To her, fine dining was a world of status, an exclusive club where appearance was just as important as money. And she could spot the type instantly. The kind who wandered in unaware of the kind of establishment they had entered. The ones who, after taking a glance at the menu, would realize their mistake and slip out quietly before embarrassing themselves. He doesn't belong here, she thought, her fingers tightening around the notepad in her hand. She had seen it before, the uncertainty in their eyes, the hesitation, the nervous glances at the other guests who so clearly belonged. But this man, he wasn't nervous. He wasn't embarrassed. In fact, he looked completely unfazed by the judgmental glances being thrown his way. He simply scanned the room with calm, observant eyes, taking in the space as though he were completely at ease. Ashley sighed, adjusting the apron around her waist. Fine. If he wanted to embarrass himself, That was his problem. Forcing a polite but insincere smile onto her face, she walked up to him, tilting her head slightly. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" she asked, her voice carrying the subtle undertone of disbelief, as if she were doing him a favor by questioning him before he made a fool of himself. The man met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Yes," he said simply. "I heard this place has great food." His voice was steady, unbothered by the scrutiny. Ashley suppressed an eye roll. "Well, just so you know, our menu is quite expensive." She made sure to emphasize the last two words, speaking just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. A few chuckles rippled through the restaurant. The man remained composed. "That's fine," he replied, offering a polite smile. "I'd love a table." Ashley hesitated. She had expected him to shift uncomfortably, maybe mumble an excuse and leave. Instead, he just stood there, calm, unshaken, her lips pressed into a thin line. Fine. If he wanted a table, she would give him one, but not just any table. She turned sharply on her heel, leading him through the dining floor, passing by the lavish booths near the panoramic windows where guests dined with breathtaking views of the city skyline, past the intimate, candlelit tables where expensive wine flowed freely. Instead, she walked him straight to the worst seat in the restaurant, a small, cramped table near the kitchen doors where the sounds of clattering dishes, shouting chefs, and the occasional burst of steam from the kitchen ruined the otherwise serene atmosphere. The table was positioned awkwardly, half hidden from the rest of the dining area, almost as if it had been placed there as an afterthought. She pulled out the chair. "There you go," she said with forced politeness. "This should be comfortable for you." Still, the man didn't protest. He simply pulled out the chair, sat down, and picked up the menu. Ashley folded her arms and waited, expecting the inevitable moment of hesitation. "Go on," she thought. "Take a look at those prices and realize your mistake." But instead, he flipped through the pages casually, completely unfazed. "I'll have the chef's special," he said, pointing to one of the most expensive dishes on the menu. Ashley's eyebrows shot up. She nearly laughed. "Does he even realize how much that costs?" "Are you sure?" she asked, her tone dripping with doubt. "Yes," he replied with a smile. "It sounds delicious." Ashley forced another tight-lipped smile. "All right," she said, snatching the menu from his hands. But as she turned, a brilliant idea formed in her mind. She wouldn't send his order to the kitchen right away. No, she would make him wait. She would serve the wealthy guests first, ensuring they got their meals promptly, while he sat there, slowly realizing the true price of dining somewhere like this. She wanted to see if he'd squirm, if he'd grow uncomfortable, if he'd finally realize that this place wasn't for people like him. What she didn't realize was that her little lesson was about to backfire in the most unexpected way. Minutes trickled by like grains of sand in an hourglass. At first, it was barely noticeable, just another guest waiting for his food like everyone else. But as time stretched on, the subtle differences became apparent. 15 minutes, then 30, then 45. Nearly an hour had passed, yet the man remained seated, undisturbed, patient as ever. Ashley, stationed behind the counter, took occasional glances at him, her amusement growing with each passing minute. She had been deliberately delaying his order, making sure every other guest, the ones who belonged, received their meals first. She expected signs of impatience, of frustration, maybe a restless tapping of fingers against the table, a weary glance at his watch, or even the slightest shift in his seat, but nothing. The man sat with a quiet ease, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. Every now and then, he took small sips from the glass of water a busboy had left on his table earlier. He didn't fidget. He didn't glare at her or try to flag down another waiter. He didn't sigh or check his phone like most people would. If anything, he seemed completely unbothered. Ashley frowned slightly, gripping the tray in her hands. Something about his composure unsettled her. This wasn't the reaction she had expected. Most people, especially those who had never stepped foot in a restaurant like this before, would have grown uncomfortable by now. But not him. And it wasn't just Ashley who noticed. At a nearby window table, an elderly couple had been watching everything unfold. They had seen the way Ashley greeted him with thinly veiled condescension. They had seen how she led him to the worst seat in the house. And now they were seeing how he waited, undisturbed, while others around him were served plate after plate of gourmet dishes. The older woman leaned in slightly, whispering to her husband, "He hasn't eaten yet." The old man nodded, stealing another glance toward the man. "And he's been here for nearly an hour." A few tables away, another pair of guests took notice as well. A group of businessmen, each sipping expensive whiskey, exchanged looks of curiosity. Even the staff had started to whisper. A young waiter, new to the restaurant, nudged his co-worker while discreetly eyeing the man. "Why is he still waiting?" he asked in a hushed voice. "Did his order get lost or something?" His co-worker, an older server with more experience, shook his head slightly. "No," he murmured. "Ashley's making him wait on purpose." The younger waiter frowned. "But the other server exhaled through his nose, "because he doesn't look like he belongs here." At that moment, Ashley finally decided it was time. She strutted toward the kitchen, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. Plating the dish, she placed it onto her tray and walked back toward his table with deliberate, slow steps. Her heart beat with a quiet thrill. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Reaching his table, she set the plate down in front of him. Not gently, not with the grace usually displayed when serving high-profile guests, but with a slight thud, as if placing it before him was an inconvenience. She tilted her head, a smug smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Here you go," she said, her voice carrying a distinct edge of mockery. "I hope it's up to your standards." She fully expected him to hesitate, to pick at the food with uncertainty, maybe even second-guess whether he could afford it. Instead, the man simply picked up his utensils and took a bite. "This is great," he said casually, nodding in approval. Ashley blinked. She had prepared herself for amusement, for discomfort, for some level of embarrassment on his part. But this wasn't the reaction she had anticipated at all. He wasn't flustered. He wasn't overwhelmed. He was completely fine, almost like he had been through this before. For the first time that evening, a flicker of uncertainty passed through her. She shook the feeling off, straightening her shoulders. Whatever, it didn't matter. His moment of embarrassment would come soon enough. She let him eat, giving him time to savor the meal. Let him enjoy it while he can, she thought, because the final blow was still to come. After a while, when she was sure he had finished, she grabbed the bill, printed on the sleekest, most elegant paper the restaurant used, and made her way back to his table. This was it. With a sharp tap, she placed the bill in front of him, her smirk returning. "There you go," she said smoothly. "Take your time." And then she folded her arms, watching, waiting. She had done this before. She knew how it went. The widened eyes, the nervous fumbling for a wallet, the embarrassed glance around the room, the excuse-making. "Maybe I forgot my card, or I didn't realize it was so expensive." It was always the same. But before he could even pick up the check, something changed. A ripple passed through the air, subtle yet undeniable. The soft hum of conversation in the restaurant shifted. A tension, a quiet buzz, settled over the guests. It was the kind of shift that happened when something unexpected was unfolding, something people couldn't ignore. Ashley felt it too. Then a voice, sharp, surprised, cut through the air. "Wait, is that?" Heads turned. A man sitting a few tables away, a sharply dressed businessman, his Rolex glinting under the dim lighting, had risen from his chair, his gaze locked on to the diner in shock. Ashley's brows furrowed. "What now?" she muttered under her breath. Before she could make sense of it, she saw movement from the back of the restaurant. The manager, rushing toward the table. His usually composed expression was gone, replaced by something she had never seen before, panic. His eyes darted between the seated guest and Ashley, his breathing uneven. And then the words that shattered everything. "Sir, I had no idea you were here," the manager practically stammered as he reached the table, his hands wringing together in nervousness. "If we had known, we would have prepared a private dining area for you immediately." Ashley's smirk vanished. A cold chill ran down her spine. She looked at the man in front of her, the man she had mocked, ignored, dismissed, the man she had treated as a nobody. But now, with the manager's frantic reaction and the businessman's stunned expression, the realization hit her like a freight train. Confusion twisted in her stomach. Who was he? Why was the manager, who had never flinched, even when billionaires dined here, suddenly scrambling to apologize? The other guests had caught on now, their whispers growing louder. Ashley's heartbeat pounded in her ears as she watched the man, the same man she had looked down upon, finally pick up the check she had smugly placed before him. He examined it briefly, then set it down and looked up at the manager with a calm, unwavering expression. "No need for special treatment," he said simply. "I just came for a meal." The manager paled. No, sir. Please forgive the oversight. If I had known, I would have made sure you were taken care of properly." Ashley's stomach churned. The weight of her mistake was sinking in. She had assumed he was a nobody, just a regular guy, someone not worthy of her respect. But now it was clear. She had been wrong, terribly, horribly wrong. And in just a few moments, she was about to find out exactly how big of a mistake she had made. Ashley's hands grew clammy, a cold sweat forming at the nape of her neck as she shifted uncomfortably. The once confident smirk that had danced on her lips all evening was now gone, wiped clean by the weight of the moment pressing down on her like an invisible force. Her heart pounded, the rhythmic thumping echoing in her ears like a drum roll, leading up to a verdict she didn't want to hear. Who was this man? Her mind raced, desperately trying to put the pieces together. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had been in control. She had been the one with the upper hand, subtly humiliating a man she believed didn't belong. But now the tables had turned so fast it left her dizzy. Why was the manager, normally the picture of cool professionalism, now scrambling, his voice laced with panic? Why were the other guests, the very people who had chuckled along with her earlier, now leaning in, whispering among themselves, their eyes darting between her and the man she had dismissed? The restaurant had fallen into a stunned, almost eerie silence. Forks rested on half-eaten plates. Conversations had ceased mid-sentence. Even the soft melody of the grand piano in the background seemed to fade, as if the entire room was holding its breath. Ashley swallowed hard, her throat tightening. For the past hour, she had treated this man like he was beneath her. She had mocked him with condescending smiles, led him to the worst table in the house, and deliberately delayed his order just to prove a point. And now she was realizing the depth of her mistake in the most humiliating way possible. The man, still composed, set the bill down on the table and looked up at the manager. His eyes, steady, unreadable, held none of the emotions Ashley had been expecting. No anger, no indignation, no wounded pride. "I appreciate the concern," he said, his voice smooth, controlled. "But there's no need to make a scene. I only wanted to enjoy a meal." His words were calm, yet they carried an unmistakable authority that made the manager visibly swallow. The manager, looking almost as pale as Ashley felt, turned abruptly to her. His eyes bore into her, filled with something she had never seen before. Disbelief. Did you know who you were speaking to?" His voice was tight, almost incredulous. Ashley's stomach dropped. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her tongue felt heavy, her throat dry. She could only shake her head slowly, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The manager exhaled, rubbing his forehead in exasperation. His voice was urgent now, desperate to salvage what was left of the situation. "Sir, I assure you, this is not how we treat our customers. If there's anything I can do—" But before he could finish, the man raised a hand. "There's no need for all that," he said, his tone unwavering, dismissing the groveling before it could escalate. Then finally he turned his attention to Ashley. Her stomach twisted into knots. This was it. The moment of reckoning. She braced herself for what was coming next. A public scolding, a sharp rebuke, maybe even an order for her immediate dismissal. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, but what happened next took her completely by surprise. The man didn't yell. He didn't demand an apology. He didn't call her out in front of everyone. Instead, his voice remained steady, carrying none of the malice she had expected. "I don't think any of that matters." Ashley's breath hitched. The words were gentle, yet firm, like a door closing softly but definitively. Her fingers curled at her sides as she forced herself to meet his gaze. "Respect isn't about who someone is," he continued, his expression unreadable, but his voice unwavering. "It's about how we treat people, not based on their clothes, not based on assumptions, but simply as fellow human beings." His words cut through the restaurant like a blade. A hush fell over the room, pressing against the walls, filling every inch of space. Ashley felt something inside her crack, something deeper than just embarrassment, something that burned hotter than mere humiliation. Regret, real, genuine regret, the kind that sat heavy in her chest, pressing against her ribs, making it harder to breathe. She had been so quick to judge, so eager to prove that this man didn't belong. And yet, here he was, standing before her, not as a vengeful customer, not as someone looking for an apology, but as someone who had every reason to be cruel to her, and chose not to be. Ashley swallowed hard, feeling a lump rise in her throat. Her voice trembled as she finally spoke. I'm so sorry," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. "I shouldn't have treated you like that." For the first time that evening, the arrogance, the superiority, the self-righteousness she had clung to so tightly vanished. The man studied her for a moment. Then he nodded. Mistakes happen, he said. But what matters is whether we choose to learn from them. Ashley felt her face grow hot, a mix of shame and something else, something deeper. Because this wasn't anger. This wasn't revenge. This was grace. And somehow, that made it so much worse. She dropped her gaze, staring at the floor as guilt twisted inside her like a knife. I understand, she murmured, barely above a whisper. I promise I won't make this mistake again. The man was silent for a moment, as if weighing her words. Then finally he gave a small nod. It's the promises we make to ourselves that matter the most, he said. And just like that, the moment passed. Without another word, he reached for his wallet, pulled out several crisp bills, and placed a generous tip on the table, more than enough to cover the meal. Ashley's breath caught in her throat. Even after everything, he still chose kindness. The restaurant remained eerily silent as he rose from his seat. He gave the manager a polite nod before turning toward the exit. And then, just like that, he was gone. Ashley stood frozen in place, her pulse still racing. But the lesson he had left behind, that would stay with her for the rest of her life. As the man walked out of the restaurant, the weight of what had just happened clung to the air like an unshakable fog. It was as if the entire establishment had been paused in time, trapped in the aftershock of something profound. The usual sounds of clinking glasses and murmured conversation were replaced by a heavy silence, thick with reflection. The guests, who had watched everything unfold like an unscripted play, remained seated in stunned quiet. Many stared at the door where the man had just exited, their eyes lingering as if expecting him to turn around and offer one final word. But he didn't. He was gone. And yet his presence remained. Some guests exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of unease and quiet disapproval. A woman in a sleek black evening gown, who had previously chuckled under her breath at Ashley's treatment of the man, now shifted in her chair uncomfortably, dabbing at her lips with a linen napkin. She stole a quick look at her date, who met her gaze with a knowing nod. An older couple near the window, who had watched everything from start to finish, sighed softly to themselves. The elderly man, who had seen decades of human behavior unfold in places like this, simply shook his head, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. His wife reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. Across the room, a group of businessmen who had barely noticed the man when he first walked in were now replaying the moment in their minds. One of them, dressed in an expensive navy blue suit, exhaled sharply and muttered, "Unbelievable," under his breath. They weren't just thinking about Ashley's behavior anymore. They were thinking about their own. How many times had they done the same thing? Judged someone based on appearances? Made quiet, dismissive assumptions about a person's worth just by looking at them? The realization was uncomfortable, but necessary. The weight of it all seemed to bear down hardest on Ashley. She stood frozen, her limbs heavy, her throat dry, as she stared at the table where the man had been sitting just moments ago. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a dull, steady rhythm that felt almost deafening in the quiet. Her eyes remained locked on the stack of crisp bills he had left behind. It wasn't just a tip, it was an act of grace, a silent statement, a deliberate choice to show kindness where most people would have sought revenge. Ashley swallowed hard. She had expected the worst. She had expected public humiliation, maybe even getting fired on the spot. After all, she had been cruel, thoughtless. She had done everything in her power to make him uncomfortable, to remind him that he didn't belong. And yet, he hadn't embarrassed her. He hadn't demanded an apology. He hadn't even looked at her with anger. Instead, he had left behind something far more lasting than a reprimand, a lesson that wouldn't just disappear with time, that couldn't be ignored or brushed off, a lesson that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. She exhaled shakily, her mind replaying his words. Respect isn't about who someone is, it's about how we treat people. The simplicity of the statement was what made it so powerful. For years, Ashley had believed that wealth was the only thing that mattered in a place like this. That status and outward appearances were what determined whether a person was worthy of respect. And yet, here was a man who had shattered that belief with nothing but patience, kindness, and quiet dignity. For the first time, she saw how wrong she had been. The truth sat heavily on her chest, forcing her to confront a part of herself she had never truly questioned before. Her fingers clenched at her apron as she turned, almost hesitantly, to the manager. Her voice, usually so sharp and controlled, was now barely above a whisper. "I really messed up, didn't I?" The manager, who had been watching her closely, studied her face. He didn't speak right away. His eyes, usually filled with irritation whenever a server made a mistake, held something different this time. Something expectant. Finally, he nodded once. Yes, he said simply, honestly. You did. Ashley inhaled sharply, bracing herself for the reprimand she knew was coming. But then, his next words hit harder than any scolding ever could. But the real question is, what are you going to do about it? Ashley's lips parted slightly. There it was, the one thing she hadn't expected. A choice, not a punishment, not a dismissal, a choice. She exhaled deeply, the weight of everything crashing over her all at once. She didn't need to say anything else. She already knew what she had to do. From that night on, she made a silent promise to herself. She would never judge someone by their appearance again. Not because she feared getting embarrassed like this again, but because for the first time in her life, she understood. She truly understood that wealth doesn't define a person, that a tailored suit doesn't equal importance, and a worn-out jacket doesn't equal irrelevance. That dignity isn't something you wear, it's something you carry. And that the way you treat someone when you think they are nobody says more about you than it ever will about them. The restaurant, once just a place of fine dining, became something else that night. A place where a powerful lesson was learned. A lesson that wasn't just for Ashley, but for everyone who had witnessed it. Some lessons in life come when we least expect them, but they stay with us forever. This story wasn't just about a meal in a fancy restaurant. It was about a choice. The choice to judge or to show kindness. The choice to look down on someone or to treat them with respect. What would you have done in Ashley's place? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories that make you think, that leave you with something to carry forward in life, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are plenty more stories like this waiting for you.